Uh-oh. Good morning. How you all today? It's good to be here again. I noticed the other day the president took his face mask off in the Oval Office. That was a sign that we could take ours off if we've had the shots. You got to get the shots, he said. So apparently we're starting to lighten up a little bit on this virus, and that's very good. This morning we're going to continue Paul's third missionary journey. We're at chapter 18, studying verses 1 through 18. We've been studying this for a little bit. We're analyzing the text at this time. The transition, this is where we left off last week, I believe. The transition from Judaism to Christianity was probably more difficult than any of us could possibly expect. And it's important, I think, for us to know that. Sometimes we think about the apostles as sinless men. Well, they weren't. They were men, just like any other man, whether it's Paul or Peter or whoever. They had to learn just like you and I do, and they had to practice just like we do. They went through all the ups and downs of life like we do. And sometimes that idea gets skewed, especially the way religious groups have elevated, especially the apostles. They call them saints, whereas we're not saints. Saint is something, according to the Catholic Church, the person is elevated to having accomplished so much in their life. But we know that we're all saints. When we become a Christian, we are a saint, and we don't elevate the apostles in the sense that they do. We admire them greatly, envy them somewhat, because they were with the Lord. Glad we weren't there, because most of them died a very violent death. But they had a hard time switching from Judaism to Christianity. There were a lot of things that they had been trained with most all of their life. The law and the prophets, rabbinical teachings, preconceived notions they held, and the prejudices they had. They grew up with all these things, and it hindered them when they tried to learn Christian principles. It was very difficult for it. Today, they're talking about systemic racism. Everybody who's white is automatically a racist. Just because you're white, you're born a racist. And beware, because that's what they're wanting to teach in school. Okay, under this critical race theory thing. Bad. That's very bad. I've read part of it, excerpts from it. They even brought the church into it. Well, religion. Teaching children that belief in God is a very dangerous thing. That's in that also. Keep that in mind. These men at this time had a lot of baggage they were dealing with. It had been burned into their brains. Their great-great-grandparents did it, and all the way down to them. And learning Christianity, which was really different from what they had been taught, was very hard. And then, of course, they were also dealing with the Gentiles, who, for the most part, had no education about Jehovah God whatsoever. As a matter of fact, what they had been taught was that there is no one God; every God is God. So they were very different in their thinking too. If you could imagine growing up in that environment, believing it, and practicing it for the most part, you could probably understand a little better how hard it was on those people. And as we know, even the apostles struggled. I'm saying all this because I want to point out some of the struggles Paul dealt with in particular. Paul found himself going back to practices of Judaism occasionally, but rightfully so. He had been trained in these things. He was trying to make peace between the Jew and the Gentile, and on occasion he was a practitioner of the rites of the rabbis. Primarily, it was rabbinical teachings that he got caught up with. Uh, when you read the writings of Paul, one of the things you notice about Paul is his compassion. He had an enormous amount of compassion. Modernists today say that Paul hated women and yada, yada, yada. He had all these faults, which is not the case at all. He was an extremely compassionate man. What he didn't like hypocrisy. He didn't like people who, were proud, religious people who were very proud. He didn't like any of those things at all. And I think one of the reasons he was so against pride as a Christian is because he came up to the school of hard knocks, like many of us did. We know what it's like to be ignorant. Paul knew what it was like to be ignorant. A lot of us know what it's like to be ignorant, not having any real religious training. I was about 24, something like that, before I started learning about Christianity, and everything I thought was wrong, and I had to be undone and then done back, and it was very hard. It's hard to do, especially when you're ignorant and got preconceived notions. Well, Paul, I think, was a lot like that, and he was very gentle with people, and I think sometimes some have had a problem with Paul because he wasn't as hard-nosed as they are. Take Romans 14:1. We know what the problem was. There were two basic problems that he discusses. One has to do with the head covering of a woman, and the other one had to do with eating meats. Many of the Jews, many of the Hindus, a lot of the Hindus, and even the pagans, they had a big problem with eating meat because the way they grew up, meat, animal was offered to a pagan god, and then it was slaughtered, taken to the local market, and people bought that meat. And when they went home and put a steak on the table, they were eating a steak been offered a Zulu god or whoever he might have been. And now they're being told it's okay to eat meat, and they're scratching their head. This doesn't make any sense. This meat's been offered to pagan gods. How can we possibly eat it? Paul, he probably went through the same tussle, but he knows better at this stage in his life. By the time he wrote the Roman letter, and he discusses it, and he shows a lot of compassion for those who are ignorant about such matters. Receive one who is weak in the faith. The word there, the article, shouldn't be there. That doesn't belong there. It's not the faith. There's a big difference between faith and the faith. The faith has to do with the gospel system, generally the Word of God, the church, something of that nature. Faith is a belief that we have, a belief that we hold. And what he's talking about, there are some people, their belief is weak, okay, their belief. Why? Well, because their understanding is weak. If our faith rests on our knowledge and understanding, then if our faith is weak, it's because our knowledge and understanding is weak. Well, doesn't that make a person bad? No, it makes a person a learner, just like all of us. When I didn't know the difference, I didn't know that Christ wasn't born on Christmas, for example. I wrote a bulletin one time, and on the cover of it, I said, "Keep Christ in Christmas." That's the way I thought it was supposed to be. It was always that way my whole life. And then I learned later that, well, that's not the case at all. I was completely ignorant, and a lot of people are ignorant. And it doesn't matter the age. A person could be, 13 and be ignorant about the gospel. A person could be 70 and be ignorant about the gospel. It's got nothing to do with age. It has to do with what a person has learned, because faith rests on our knowledge. If we've learned little about the gospel of the Christ, then our faith can't be any greater than little. That's the best we can do, because our faith doesn't outdistance our knowledge. So all the people who had just been converted to Christianity, some people who may have been converted to Christianity for a few years, and they're tussling over this meat issue. They don't understand how it could possibly be right to eat meat. there's so many discussions. I could bring up some right now, and I don't want to because we might have to finish it. I don't want to have to finish it right now. But there's so many discussions that's been had over something that people assume is evil, only to discover that in its simplicity is not evil at all. We can make it evil, but it's not evil itself. There's nothing in the world that's evil. If I don't quit, I'm going to get into it. There's nothing in the world that's evil. There's no substance that is evil. Marijuana is not evil. Who created marijuana? And what did he say when he got done creating all these things? It is very good. These things aren't evil in and of themselves. They're nothing. They're substance. They have no inherent nature. The only thing that could possibly be evil is human beings. And okay, you got marijuana sitting there. Perhaps it's got a good purpose to it. Perhaps it's not. People get high on it and do foolish things because they're high on drugs and things of that nature. But there's and they say there is an advantage to marijuana for some people. There are so many things that could be discussed that aren't settled in our minds yet. And I'm talking about us. It's not settled in our minds yet. We're still wrestling with it. We don't understand some things. How could this possibly be okay? Well, given the right circumstances, it might be. It just might be. And we have to be careful about what we call sin. Because we don't want to call things sin that's not sin. I've always encouraged people to live by a rule of thumb. Never be dogmatic if you don't have to. Dogmatic means stick to it and you don't move. Baptism. We're dogmatic about baptism. Why? Because the Bible is crystal clear about baptism. A person who is not baptized is a person who has not had their sins taken away, right? There are some things in the Bible that is set, and you can't move to the right or to the left. The Lord's Supper, so many different things. But there are a great many things that aren't necessarily set in stone. We think this is wrong. But when you study it, what you wind up discovering is that, in my opinion, it's wrong. Okay? Let me give you, I had a discussion one time with anti-Church of Christ. They think we're wrong about, well, in this case, they think we're wrong about divided Bible classes. And back about 25 years ago, I guess it was now, I had a discussion with a preacher, and I could tell he understood that divided Bible classes in and of themselves were not bad. But what he said was this. He says, don't you see how having divided Bible classes is going to lead to a lot of problems? Such as you got women teachers. How long will it be before women take over the pulpit? You got these classes going on. You don't know what's being taught in each of these classes. You can't be in all the classes at the same time. He named off a whole string of things that this could possibly lead to. And I have to agree, it's possible. It could lead to these things. But can I call a thing a sin because it might lead to something that's wrong? It might be my opinion that it's best not to have divided Bible classes. That could be my opinion, and that's fine. I'm entitled to my opinion. But I can't make it a law that you cannot have divided Bible classes. Why? Because the scriptures don't teach it. The point I used with this fella was immersion in water for remission of sins. The antis, they believe in immersion in water. And what I told him was, I said, I think we ought to quit baptizing people. And he said, we can't. The Lord told us to. And I said, well, when when you introduce baptism into the equation, it's going to lead to a lot of problems. Some people, they're going to start sprinkling instead of immersion. Some people are going to start pouring instead of immersion. Some people are going to start baptizing babies. He said, yeah, but you can't negate baptism because of what men have done to it. And that's the same thing I'm saying. You can't negate divided Bible classes because of what people might do with it. That could be my opinion that this is going to lead to something bad. I might even be right. But that doesn't make it a sin. Only God can identify a sin. I don't have the ability to identify sin unless Jehovah points it out to me first. Now, Paul's dealing with a meat issue, and this is how he goes about it. Don't call a thing sin if it's not sin. What you ought to do is have compassion on your brother. You know, he doesn't understand. He doesn't have much knowledge yet. And he thinks it's wrong to eat meat. Well, what do you do in a case like that? Well, in this case, this particular case, Paul said, as long as the world stands, I won't eat meat. Because I'm not going to offend my brother over something so silly as meat. And some people actually think he's wrong for taking that position. I don't think so. I think a man's soul is worth more than a hamburger. It's not really a problem for us today. It was a giant problem back in the first century. But anyway, receive one into the assembly who is weak in faith, is without much knowledge, but not to disputes over doubtful things. Now, if he starts causing problems, you may have to remove this fellow from the fellowship. You don't want a bunch of doubts and arguments taking place in the assembly. If it comes to that, you may have to put this fellow out of the church. Under such circumstances, of course, that'd be a decision the elders would have to make. But receive a man who is weak in faith, but don't let it become a bad thing. One person, he did the difference in people. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Some people, they didn't work on the Sabbath. All their life they've been taught not to work on the Sabbath. Now they become Christians. And when it comes to Sabbath day, they don't work. They won't work. Are they evil? Is that sin? Does that make them bad? Well, not necessarily. Maybe it just wounds their conscience. Maybe they can't work because it's been drilled in their heads all their life. Maybe they're not trying to honor the law of Moses. They're simply trying to live out a custom they were trained with all their life. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. That's where the trial takes place. It's in the mind of the individual. I might think something's wrong. And if I'm fully convinced that it is wrong, I'm supposed to abstain from it. The rest of you may not agree with that whatsoever. And then if you're fully convinced in your mind that I am wrong, you should disregard me and live by what you believe to be right. You have to be your own judge, jury, executioner. On most things, actually, that's what it'll come to. You have to determine for yourself whether this is wrong for you or not. If it's wrong for you, don't do it. If it's right for you, you can do it, but you might not want to do it. Therefore, he says, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather let us resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. I know a lady that thinks women are to wear a scarf over their head or a hat, something like that. And she asked me about one time. We talked about it. I taught her about it. And she said, well, I hear everything you're saying, but I still feel like I ought to wear something. What should I do? I said, wear it. If you're convinced that you ought to have a cover on your head, wear it. I said it's neither good or evil. It's got nothing to do with anything. If you want to wear it, wear it. If you don't, then don't. But just don't tell anybody else that they have to wear it. That's when you cross the line. You're settling a matter in your own mind, your own soul. You're settling this matter. And you may not be able to settle it like most people do in the case of the head covering. A woman couldn't settle it in her own mind. What'd she do? She has to live accordingly. But that doesn't mean anybody else has to. Well, what about those who think she's wrong? Don't say anything. Let it go. Don't create a fuss over that. Don't go looking for an argument over that. Who cares? If she wears a covering on her head, if she doesn't wear a covering, who cares? What's that got to do with the price of bacon? I mean, it affects nothing at all. So maintain peace. Let her wear her cover, and the rest, don't wear a cover. As long as nobody's accusing anybody else, hey, everything's good. We got no problem. Just don't put the stumbling block in front of the other. Don't condemn the person wearing the cover. Don't condemn the person not wearing the cover. Don't do that. You got no way to. What did God say about the cover? He said we ought to wear. Now that's what I didn't want to do right there, and I just did it. I don't want to get into head covering discussion. Let me say this. If you want to talk about it another day, we'll talk about it another day. God said nothing about the head covering. The only thing he said was one thing, and that's an implication. In the city of Corinth, he didn't want the women to crop their hair anymore. That's what the prostitutes did. That's what some of the Christian ladies were starting to do because it was fashionable, it was chic, it was in vogue. It was the thing to do if you wanted to be a beautiful woman. So they started cropping their hair like these prostitutes did. And Paul wrote to them the Corinthian epistle telling them not to do that. At least according to historians, that's what the battle was over. But as far as the length of a person's hair, or wearing a head cover, or wearing a veil, what did Jehovah say about it in the New Testament? Nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. He spoke about it in the Old Testament, but he said nothing about it in the New Testament. So when it comes to head coverings, just be indifferent about it. It doesn't matter. I don't care one way or the other if somebody wears a cover on their head. It's not my business as far as I'm concerned. Then he goes on to say, we then who are strong in faith, have a lot of faith because we have a lot of knowledge, we who are strong in faith ought to bear with the scruples of those who are weak in faith. They don't understand what we understand, Paul is saying. Instead of calling him on the carpet for being dumb, be tolerant of their lack of understanding, their lack of faith in the matter. Don't call them on the carpet. Let it go. Because what does it matter? We ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not just be out to please ourselves. And that's the way it has to be sometimes. There's not a definitive answer on many, many questions that I get. There's not a definitive answer. It's one that has to be answered by the individual in their own heart, determined by what strength their faith is. And trust me, that's the hard part of Christian living. It can take years to understand something. But then, you think that's the way the Lord wanted it. He wanted us to grapple with right and wrong, good and evil. He wanted us to think about it. He wanted us to apply it to ourselves, gather up the knowledge on the given subject, and then draw our own conclusion. It's called growing spiritually. And that's what Jehovah has always wanted. The only point I wanted to make today is Paul's great compassion. Why? Because there was a time when he needed great compassion. He was completely ignorant of the Christian system. And when he was converted that day on the Damascus highway, he had to learn. He had to start learning from ground zero. And just like you and I, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. There was something, I don't remember what it was now, but there was something a couple of weeks ago I read. It was an entire paragraph, actually. And I learned something I did not know. Okay, I studied a lot in my life, but I ran across something I did not know. I had no idea, love, as a matter of fact. No telling how many times I read that passage, and what I learned the other day, I never knew before, and I was surprised by that. I'm always surprised because I usually don't go too long before I learn something I didn't see before. We're all in a learning process. Some are learning more than others, only because they probably got a later start than we do. Rather than picking on such people for their lack of understanding, we are to rejoice in the fact that we've had the opportunity to learn the truth about a given matter and have peace in the church. That's what's important. He's not saying sin is good. He's not saying tolerate sin. Not at all. You know Paul better than that. He's talking about matters of indifference. Don't be a bully in matters of indifference. Now then, let's go back to Acts. I don't want any questions over that stuff. This isn't the right time. Verse 18, we'll continue to the end of it. Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren, and he sailed for Syria. And Priscilla and Aquila were with him as he sailed off. And here we're told he had his hair cut off at Centuria, for he had taken a vow and sworn to the vow by cutting his hair off. Paul was in Corinth. He was in Corinth there with Priscilla and Aquila. He had his hair cut and took a vow. Then they jumped on a boat and they sailed over to Ephesus. And that brings us to the next section we're fixing to get into. Paul's very brief time in the city of Ephesus. We'll read and analyze it because it's very short. Paul came to Ephesus and he left them, that is Priscilla and Aquila, he left them there in Ephesus. Remember, he's going back to Syria. He's not taking them to Syria with him. They need to stay here roundabouts Ephesus. But when he left them, he entered the synagogue and he went to reasoning with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, they were learning, he wouldn't do it. He said, I can't stay. He took leave of them. He left them, saying, I must, by all means, keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. I think it was Pentecost, okay? Could have been Passover. I think it was Pentecost that Paul was trying to get back to Jerusalem for. But see, right there, I can't be dogmatic about it because I don't know that as a matter of fact. That's an educated guess, okay? And somebody says, well, I think he was going back, wanted to get back in time for Passover. Hey, I'm not going to argue with you. That might be right. I don't know. I just think it's Pentecost. And he sailed away from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up, he greeted the church in Jerusalem, and then he went down to Antioch. What do we have here? We have Paul in Ephesus. He wants to go to Syria over on the right side of your screen. He's got to get on a ship. He probably went down to Miletus, down here. Miletus, he could get on a ship. He would sail then over to Patara, which was a shipping port. And from Patara, he would hop on another boat, and it would take him all the way over to Caesarea. Now, that's about 4 to 6 weeks journey, probably 4 weeks journey. He landed in Caesarea. Then he needed to go to Jerusalem to keep the feast. So he went up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem. He went south, right? But the text says he went up because he did go up. Jerusalem's up on the mountain, so he went up. The Bible's always right when it comes to going up and down. It's never wrong. It's amazing to go through and see that. He went to Jerusalem. He kept the feast there in Jerusalem, and then he left there. He may have went to Caesarea, got back on a boat, took a boat up to Antioch, or he could have traveled by land and went to Antioch. The text does not tell us. But that's the travel of Paul as he returned back home. He got to Ephesus by going through the northern territories, and now he's coming back through the south. We're going to read and analyze verses 23 to 28. Priscilla and Aquila meet Apollos at Ephesus. This is kind of like a parenthetical statement. Okay, it's about the travels of Paul. And Luke has ended with Paul at Antioch, and directly he'll start up again with Paul at Antioch. But in between, he wants to introduce this fellow named Apollos, because he's going to explain a lot of things. Paul was in Ephesus for just a moment, and then he was gone. And when he goes back, he's going to find believers who believe in the wrong thing. And Luke is answering the question for us before we even ask it. While Paul was absent from Ephesus, this fellow Apollos was there, and he was teaching, and he didn't know a whole lot. Let's go through the text. After Paul had spent some time there, that is there at Antioch, he departed, went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. That was his mission, going back through the churches. He was holding gospel meetings as he went. And then he went on. He probably left Antioch, probably stopped at Tarsus. That's where his family lived. That's where he was raised, there in the city of Tarsus. And then he would journey on into the region of Galatia, southern Galatia at least, and then he would go down to Phrygia. And going down to Phrygia, his final stop, of course, would be back to the city of Ephesus once again. That's what Paul will do. But while he's in motion, something else is happening. And this is where Apollos comes in. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man. He's a good speaker. He had a very good speech about him. And he was mighty in the scriptures. He knew the Old Testament scriptures very well. He was mighty in these scriptures. He too came to the city of Ephesus. Now we've got Paul over here in Antioch. Apollos is winding up here at Ephesus, but he came from down in Egypt, from Alexandria. More than likely he just crossed the sea and wound up at Ephesus up there in his journey. But this is where Apollos is, while Paul is to the east in Antioch. And while Paul is making his travel over to Ephesus, these things are happening in Ephesus with Apollos. This man, Apollos, had been instructed in the way of the Lord. Now we know that his instruction was limited. He was limited to the teachings of John the Baptizer. He was very unknowledgeable about the Christian system, and what he did have knowledge in was the way of John the Baptizer. He knew the Old Testament scriptures. He had been taught about John the Baptizer, having been baptized unto John. And being fervent in the spirit, man, he was on fire. He had a fire burning in his bones. Being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. You can see where the emphasis. He was accurate. Whenever he talked about the Old Testament, when he talked about the teachings of John, he was accurate. But when it got into the new covenant, the covenant they were living under at this present time, that's where the problem arose. He had been taught Moses, the prophets, and John the Baptizer up till John's death. And after that, he probably received bits and pieces about Christianity. Probably heard the name Jesus, didn't know a lot about him. Probably heard about maybe a few other things, but he didn't know much. He hadn't come face to. He lived down in Egypt. He hadn't come face to face with Christians at that time. This may be his first personal encounter with Christian people. Was he a saved person? That's the question. Now, don't say yes or no, because if you do, you might be wrong. I'll show you how it goes. He knew only the baptism of John. That means he was baptized according to John's baptism. Well, the question is, was he a saved person? Since he had been since he only knew the baptism of John. Here's how we understand such things. The baptism of John was nailed to the cross, according to Paul in Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. The law was nailed to the cross. That's the law of Moses, the prophets, and John the Baptizer. He was a part of the Old Testament law also. That law was nailed to the cross. Apollos, if he was baptized before the death of Christ, if he was baptized after the death of Christ, which seems more likely, if he had been baptized before John's death, he would have been a saved person, because he was baptized according to the law that existed at that time. But if Jesus had already died and he was baptized according to John's baptism after the death of Jesus, then the answer to the question would be he was not saved. He was a lost person. We're in this difficult area right here, this transitional period, and it's hard to understand sometimes unless you accumulate some information. We don't know exactly when Apollos was baptized. I think it was probably after the death of Jesus. If he had been baptized before the death of Jesus, he probably would have known something about Jesus by this time, but he did not. So, knowing only the baptism of John, this is the baptism that Apollos practiced. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue in Ephesus with great confidence. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him preaching, they took him aside, and they explained to him the way of God more accurately. That he knew a little bit about it, but not enough. Sometimes, when I wrote an article about keeping Christ in Christmas, I was sincere in my heart. I had a clear conscience, even though my words were incorrect. My conscience was clear because I thought I was right. That doesn't make it right, but I can say that I had a clear conscience. And this is what Paul says. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Does that mean he never sinned? No. It means he never violated his conscience. He lived in harmony with his conscience. Whenever you see Paul doing something that is not right, he was doing it with a clear conscience. How do you know? He says so right here. And I know that has to be the case. Jesus said to the Sadducees in Matthew 22:29, "You are mistaken. Why? You don't know the Scriptures. How could you possibly do what the Lord wants you to do if you don't know what it is the Lord wants you to do? You have to have knowledge. When you have knowledge, then you can do what the Lord wants you to do. But what happens before you have knowledge? And right now, every one of us sitting here lack knowledge. There's things that God has revealed to us in the Scriptures that we don't know yet. Does that mean because we're not doing it, we're evil people? No, it means we lack knowledge. Are we living with a clear conscience? Absolutely we are. Why? Because we don't know we're supposed to do it. How can you do what you don't know you're supposed to do? And so far, I haven't been able to comprehend whatever it is I might be missing. It's the mercy of God comes into play, where God is merciful towards us. Like we're supposed to be merciful towards one another because this brother has weak faith. God is merciful to me. Why? Because I have weak faith too. my faith is weak. I wouldn't claim to have strong faith. Not near as strong as my Lord was, coming up short. So they were instructing him more accurately. One of the things we know they taught him about was baptism for remission of sins. We know they taught him about that, but whether or not he practiced that in Ephesus, I don't know, because he didn't stay in Ephesus long after that. What he learned was the death of our Lord, as well as the establishment of the kingdom of God. That's what Aquila and Priscilla would have filled him in on. This is what he didn't know. He only knew the teaching of John. When he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures, Old Testament scriptures, that Jesus is the Christ. His preaching's changed now all of a sudden. Notice how it all happened. In Ephesus, he knew only the baptism of John. In Corinth, he was now vigorously contending for the deity of Jesus of Nazareth. You can see where he had learned and what he had learned in that brief time he spent with Aquila and Priscilla. He learned a great deal. So when he got in Corinth, maybe because he had a new start, didn't know anybody, they didn't know him, he started again, except this time now he's preaching Jesus, a person he had never preached before. Why? Because he didn't know who he was. Can't preach him if you don't know who he is. Remember, he came up out of Egypt, Alexandria. How far are we away from stopping, Donnie? Okay, might as well stop in. We got too far to go and no time to get there. I'm eastbound. Just watch old Mabery run. I heard a song that sounded like that one time. Bible study is a very difficult thing, very difficult. There's a lot to be learned, and I always wish we knew more than we do. But we're working on it. Just be patient. I'm a good one to talk about patience, huh?